Hello, early modern philosophy students. It's time for another online lecture. I hope you guys are learning some things from these lectures and finding some enjoyment in them. Today, I want to talk about the three student responses that I got regarding Section 12 of Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Five students were supposed to do short assignments, but I only received three. Shame on you who are not doing your short assignments. Anyway, those three, it's interesting, the three students that I received these from, Molly Walker and Luke Vanderschaft and Lindsay Selfridge, they all zoomed in on the same parts of Section 12 and came to Descartes' defense. I was a little surprised to see people defending Descartes, but I think that it's not because students are so enamored of Descartes as they are just disappointed with Hume's attack on Descartes in Section 12. But we will segue over into, and I will indeed talk about the preface and the preamble to Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. For next time, I will want you guys to read some more of Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. I want you to read the first part of the main transcendental question of the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. That's a part of the Prolegomena where Kant will talk about the nature and grounds of mathematical and geometrical knowledge. And it's really quite interesting what he has to say about those things. Also, keep in mind, you all have term papers due this Friday at 3. There will not be an online class meeting for this Friday, and there will be no short assignments due for this Friday, because I'm assuming people will be wanting to put the finishing touches on their term papers. But let's go to student writings regarding Section 12 of Hume's Inquiry. Keep in mind that Hume in the Inquiry. He spends a good bit of time, especially in the first part of Section 12. Hume spends a good bit of time talking about how it would seem that no rational argument can justify our belief in the existence of extended material objects existing external to our minds or our consciousness. He just doesn't think that we can prove this with sort of thing with well-reasoned argument. I'll go back to Hume just for a moment before I get into these responses. I'm looking at page 421 from our volume, The Empiricist, where Hume writes in section 12, and I quote from Hume, "It is a question of fact whether the perceptions of the senses be produced by external objects resembling them. How shall this question be determined? By experience, surely, as all other questions of a like nature, but here experience is and must be entirely silent. The mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects. The supposition of such a connection is therefore without any foundation in reasoning." Right? Hume doesn't think that we can give a rational argument as to why things like my computer or this chair exist as extended material objects outside of my consciousness. All that I have present to my mind are my perceptions of the chair and the computer and the cup of coffee. There's no way to rationally justify the belief that there are objects corresponding to these outside of my impressions, says Hume. But then Hume turns and he seems to be considering a Cartesian approach to this problem when he writes, "To have recourse to the veracity of the Supreme Being in order to prove the veracity of our senses is surely making a very unexpected circuit. If this veracity of the existence of God were at all concerned in this matter, our senses would be entirely infallible, because it is not possible that he, God, can ever deceive. Not to mention that if the external world be once called in question, we shall be at a loss to find arguments by which we may prove the existence of that being or any of his attributes." Right? So again, Hume is making 2 points here. That look, if God exists, then God would make our senses infallible. but our senses are not infallible. Sometimes they mislead us about the nature of reality. Therefore, there is no supremely perfect creator. Hume also makes the second point that if we're doubting the existence of the world of material physical objects existing external to our consciousness, then we're not going to have any way of proving that God exists, right? Because we use the existence of the world and the design and complexity of the world, of the material world, to explain the existence of God. And if we're doubting the existence of that world, we're not going to have any basis for arguing that God exists. The three students that wrote for today, they were disappointed with this critique of Descartes. They wanted something more here. I'll start with van der Schaaf. One reason I start with van der Schaaf is I got a kick out of the way he makes his point here. He ends up maintaining that Hume's critique of Descartes, he says, is juvenile, childish. Van der Schaaf writes, Hume's critique of Descartes is not sufficient because it is the problem of imperfection disguised as an argument about our senses. The problem of imperfection argues that God, a supremely perfect being, would not create an imperfect world with imperfections in human capacity. In Hume's argument, he's arguing that our senses are fallible, in other words, imperfect, because should they be perfect, we would see an ore as it actually is in water, not as warped or a bent image. Therefore, clearly our senses are flawed in their perceiving ability because rationality and reason support contrary to our perceptions. In response to this, Descartes would argue that God has created a perfect universe merely with imperfect parts, such as our sensory perceptions. So my question is, says van der Schaaf, how would David Hume respond to this aspect of Descartes' metaphysics? Without a response to this, David Hume's sense critique of the Cartesian solution fails to undermine Descartes' metaphysics. Since Descartes has accounted for this in his original theory, I don't see that this response as a conclusive critique of the Cartesian position. In fact, I expect more from Hume on this front. He is the only atheist we study, and this seems quite juvenile relative to his other arguments. So van der Schaaf is sorely disappointed with Hume here, it seems to me, right? And again, Hume argues that, again, if God exists, then our sensory perceptions of reality should be infallible, but we know that sometimes our senses mislead us as to the truth about reality. And so we have reason to believe from that there is no God. And what van der Schaaf is saying, van der Schaaf seems to be making a point that wait a minute. Van der Schaaf saying, Descartes argues that it's always a possibility that God exists as a supremely perfect creator, and God has decided to make a perfect world. And as van der Schaaf points out, according to Descartes, it's always conceivable that there might be imperfections internal to a perfect world. And that's why there are imperfections in the world. Maybe God's intent was to create a perfect world that would include imperfections. And van der Schaaf is suggesting that according to Descartes, it's a possibility that imperfection among the human capacities to perceive might be part of the imperfections of a creation that is on the whole perfect. And van der Schaaf wants to know, what is Hume going to say to this? I think Hume's going to insist that I think Hume, one of the things that Hume does is Hume might just be insistent on any perfect world will have nothing but perfections internal to it. Hume might challenge the idea that you can have a perfect world with imperfections internal to it. And so, if Hume is right about that, Descartes' position will still be challenged. But here, I don't know how powerful that is. Here, the two philosophers may be at loggerheads. Another thing, though, that Hume might do is Hume might also press Descartes here, and Hume might suggest that Hume might want to suggest that before we go accepting this idea that perhaps the world is better with some imperfections internal to it, Hume might want a precise explanation for how this world is better with imperfections internal to it. Hume might feel as though Descartes just sort of suggests this as a possibility without giving us any reason to think that imperfections make the world more perfect on the whole. And without an explanation for how the imperfections make the world more perfect on the whole, Hume might say we have reason to remain skeptical about how a world can be perfect with imperfections internal to it. So there's some things that he could say. It's interesting, Van der Schaaf, in coming to Descartes' defense here, he focuses. I feel like Van der Schaaf focuses on one dimension of Descartes' solution to this problem. In particular, right, it is true, Luke, that Descartes says perhaps the world is perfect on the whole with some imperfections nested within that perfect world. I would just point out that that's not all that Descartes says on this issue. And Luke, you probably know that, though, because Descartes also makes the point that we shouldn't expect human beings to have perfect knowledge and perfect sensory apparatus. We shouldn't expect that, according to Descartes, because human beings are finite, and finite things are by their nature limited. And hence God could not have given us perfect knowledge or perfect perception because of our finite natures. Right? Descartes says that as well, and that can also be said in reply to things that Hume says in section 12. And I bring this up because Molly Walker, and I'm pretty sure Lindsay Selfridge, sees upon that dimension of Descartes' response. Let me go to Selfridge real quick here. Let's see if this is there. I think it is, and I know it's there, or I think I know it's there in Walker. But Selfridge writes the following. Selfridge writes, when considering his objection to Descartes' approach, I can bring forth my own objection. David Hume argues that if material, again, I'm reading from Lindsay Selfridge. Hume argues that if material objects exist through knowledge of the existence of God, then our senses should be unfailing. Selfridge says, I would respond with an objection that Descartes would support based on his core arguments in Meditation 4 of Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. The central problem is related to skepticism on the belief of a supremely perfect being based on imperfect human beings and capacities. It is questioned that if a being such as God were to exist, then why shouldn't this being make human beings perfect and their capacities unlimited? In response, Descartes argues that while our will is unlimited, our understanding remains limited. Human beings make mistakes when we freely judge things we do not completely understand, which is not the fault of the supremely perfect being. When going back to the original objection at hand, it is possible for our senses to be imperfect and fail us at times, but for there still to exist a God that might have created human beings in this way. So the appeal to God's existence and proving the existence of material reality might be explained more than Hume acknowledges in this section. How might Hume respond to this objection? That's just interesting, actually. So I think Selfridge's defense of Descartes is a little bit different, actually, from what's there in Van der Schaaf. And I think it's different from what's there in Molly Walker's writing. And I haven't discussed Walker yet. Because because Selfridge is making a point that according to Descartes, while our senses may be fallible and our senses may sometimes lead us, Descartes thinks that this would not be God's fault that our senses mislead us, Because after all, at a certain level, what Selfridge is getting at here is that um, our our senses don't necessarily lead us to believe things. We have to pass judgment, um, informing belief. We have to pass judgment informing belief, and that involves an act of will. And right, and what Selfridge is suggesting is that it's not God's fault if we believe false things due to imperfect sensory perception, because we should all, right, and Selfridge is pointing out that according to Descartes, we should always suspend our judgment until we clearly and distinctly understand what we're judging about, right? And if we just withhold judgment until we got a clear and distinct understanding, we would never make mistakes. And so, even if our senses can be misleading, this is not any evidence that God is an imperfect creator, because it's not God's fault when we make mistakes in forming beliefs. Um, yeah, that's kind of interesting. Though, while I raise this point, I think Selfridge would probably be sympathetic with points made by Luke. I think she'd probably be sympathetic with what we'll see in Molly Walker as well. I would just say this. Um, if I understand your critique, Lindsay, if I'm Hume, I'm going to point out um, if I'm Hume, I think I'm going to point out that this criticism is somewhat misplaced, because Hume's point is that as long as the impressions, the perceptions that we have of material objects can be misleading, there's still a problem there in claiming that we are the products of a perfect creator. Because if we were the products of a perfect creator, there wouldn't be any imperfection. There shouldn't be any imperfection in our perceptions to start with, right? Now, Lindsay, you make the point that that it's up to us whether we're going to pass judgment on things that we don't clearly and distinctly perceive, and so it's our fault if we make mistakes in judgment. But Hume's going to say, yeah, but still, why is it that our perceptual apparatus is misleading at times? I mean, if God is a perfect creator, God shouldn't create these situations in which it's so difficult to understand what the truth is, because due to our own distorting perceptual apparatus. So Hume might want to push back and say that this really doesn't help matters. Okay, so anyway, that's a potential Humean response to what you're pushing, Lindsay. Lastly, let's turn quickly to Molly Walker. Walker writes, I don't agree with Descartes' approach to knowing the truth of the external world. I am going to defend Descartes' approach because Hume brings it up, yet doesn't consider all the relevant arguments Descartes references in his meditations to prove this existence. Walker continues, Hume says that Descartes' argument fails because if God exists, then our senses would be infallible. But since they are not infallible, God must not exist. But that's not true at all, according to Descartes. In addition to his other arguments for God's existence, Descartes argues that yes, God is supremely perfect and all-knowing and an all-good being. However, that does not mean he will make all his creations all perfect and all-knowing. Descartes argues that God cannot make us all perfect beings, since we are created beings, and the nature of created beings is not to be all-knowing and all-perfect. Therefore, with this alternative argument for God's existence, we can prove that God exists without the need for our senses to be infallible. Since we're all created beings, it's not in our nature to have perfectly infallible senses. Concludingly, with Descartes' approach in mind, we can prove God exists, and therefore so does the external world. I think the key point here that Molly is pushing here is that, Descartes makes this point that human beings are created. And as created, they cannot be infinite. They have to be finite, but finite means limitation. Our perceptual faculties are a created aspect of our created being, right? And so our perceptual faculties have to be limited because they are finite. And so it should come as no surprise to us that our perceptions are not perfect because of the essential finite nature of created being. Right? And so this is a way that Descartes could respond. Um, and, it's a way in which Descartes could argue, of course, and it's a way in which Descartes could say, well, of course, even if God exists, we could still have imperfect perceptual faculties because we are created beings. Now, Hume just may not have, Hume just may not put up with any of this. Hume might say, look, one movie could make you just say, look, if God is all powerful and all good, right? Well, for one, if God's all good, he would want to create perfect beings that don't fall into error and don't suffer. And then if God's all powerful, God should be able to make infinite, right, supremely perfect creations. And so, Hume may just push back on this assumption of Descartes that to be created requires finitude and limitation. That's a move he could make here. And, Hume might push back, just say that Descartes involved in sophistry and insisting that any created being by its very nature must be limited and imperfect. Hume might say, no, that's just a piece of sophistry Descartes using to cover himself in his defense of God's existence and his attempt to establish a rational justification for belief in material reality. So Hume could push that. I leave that for you guys to think about. Maybe I've gone on too long in dealing with some of this stuff. I found all three of these to be quite interesting commentaries. Certainly there are other dimensions of Section 12 of Hume's inquiry where one could go on the attack in response to Hume. Interestingly, Immanuel Kant, in the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, he goes on the critical attack, as we will see in what I'm about to talk about in his Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. I wish I had jotted something down about the Prolegomena. And you know what else? I made a mistake. I forgot to come equipped with Kant pictures, right? We're starting on a new figure. Usually I have picture day. I'm looking here at my copy of Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. I'm looking at this. This text was originally published, I believe, 1783. Kant lived his entire life in Königsberg. He's basically a German philosopher, very important figure in the history of metaphysics and epistemology, an important figure in the history of aesthetics, important figure in the history of moral philosophy. But we're going to focus on some of his metaphysical and epistemological views. We're looking at, again, we're studying we're studying basically an abbreviated articulation of Kant's metaphysical and epistemological views expressed in his Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. If I was a serious Kant scholar, and if we were doing a semester-long course on Kant's metaphysical and epistemological views, we would be studying his more extended expression of his metaphysical and epistemological views that are presented in his famous Critique of Pure Reason, which is a pretty thick tome. And the Prolegomena gives us sort of almost Kant's own sort of Cliff Notes version of his metaphysics and epistemology. And make no mistake about it, if you've looked at the outline, or maybe you're looking at the outline with me, Kant was very fascinated by Hume's critique of traditional metaphysics, and I will talk about that today. And I will even cite some passages from Kant. But without further ado, because our time's growing short, and I don't want to fall too far behind here, Let's plunge into what's here on the outline. I might, again, quote some passages from Kant to support some of my interpretation today. Look, to be clear, the central question that Kant takes up in the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, the central question he takes up is whether the metaphysical knowledge is possible. Traditionally, metaphysics has tried to uncover non-analytic, that is, synthetic knowledge regarding things like the existence of God, whether we have free will, or whether we have immortal souls. These are not mere definitional matters. Rather, they are matters of fact. And they also are not capable of being known through empirical evidence, right? It's a question of fact whether or not we have free will. It's a question of fact whether God exists. It's a question of fact whether we have immortal souls. You can't establish the truth of these things just by the analysis of concepts, right? It looks like you would need some sort of empirical evidence, and at least that's what Hume thought, to try and show that God exists, or that we have free will, or that souls are immortal. But Kant believes the question of whether metaphysical knowledge is possible, he believes that is a reasonable question to ask, because unlike science and mathematics, metaphysicians seem to be in very little agreement about what is true. I marked on my outline here to take a look at page 1 and 2 of our reading. Kant writes, in talking about metaphysics, Kant writes the following. I'm looking at pagination numbers. They're in the margins of the page. Pagination page 256, which is page 1 of my translation. Kant writes, if metaphysics, is a science, how does it happen that it cannot, like other sciences, obtain universal and permanent recognition? If not, how can it maintain its pretensions and keep the human understanding in suspense with hopes never ceasing yet never fulfilled? Whether then we demonstrate our knowledge or our ignorance in this field, we must come once for all to a definite conclusion respecting the nature of this so-called science, that is, metaphysics, which cannot possibly remain on its present footing. It seems almost ridiculous, while every other science is continually advancing, that in this, metaphysics, which pretends to be wisdom incarnate, for whose oracle everyone inquires, we should constantly move round the same spot without gaining a single step. This is Kant pointing out that, in metaphysics, there doesn't seem to be any progress at gaining more knowledge. Rather, the arguments go round and round. We're still debating whether anyone has free will. We're still debating whether God exists. We're still debating whether there are non-physical selves that are immortal and things like this. Whereas, you go to physics and chemistry and biology, and they're, actually moving forward and learning new things, and they don't keep going round and round on the same old questions. And so Kant, like Hume, thinks, hey, it's a reasonable question to ask whether or not metaphysics gives us any knowledge. Now, Kant knows that David Hume has addressed the question of the possibility of metaphysical knowledge, and Kant talks about Hume in the reading for today, right? One might think, is it not obvious that metaphysics is a bunch of baloney? After all, hasn't David Hume shown this in the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding? Somebody might look at things that way. Kant says that it was reading David Hume that awoke him from his, quote, dogmatic slumber. Kant was fascinated with Hume's critique of the traditional or school metaphysics. But Kant thought that Hume's critique suffered from a serious mistake. Thus, in the Prolegomena, Kant proposes to revisit the question of whether metaphysical knowledge is possible, and Kant wants to treat the question more carefully. Just regarding this, I took note of pages 3 and 5 from the reading for today. I just want maybe read a couple of passages where Kant talks about Hume. Page 3 and page 5. And this is about, pagination, margin page numbers. Pagination 257, near 258. Kant writes, David Hume started mainly from a single but important concept. Oh, I'm sorry. I back up. Let me back up here. This is in pagination 257. Kant writes, since the essays of Locke and Leibniz, or rather since the origin of metaphysics so far as we know its history, nothing has ever happened which could have been more decisive to the fate of metaphysics than the attack made upon it by David Hume, says Kant. David Hume threw no light on this kind of knowledge, metaphysics, but he certainly struck a spark from which light might have been obtained had it caught some inflammable substance and had its smoldering fire been carefully nursed and developed. Right? Notice Kant, he clearly thinks highly of David Hume here, and he thinks highly of Hume's critique of traditional metaphysics. But while he thinks highly of it, Kant also thinks that Hume's critique is problematic. Over and at pagination page, right, pagination 260, right, the margin page numbering. Kant also writes, I quote from Kant, I openly confess that my remembering of David Hume was the very thing which many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a quite new direction. I was far from following David Hume in the conclusions to which he arrived by considering not the whole of his problem, but a part which by itself can give us no information. If we start from a well-founded but undeveloped thought which another has bequeathed to us, we may well hope by continued reflection to advance further than the acute man to whom we owe the first spark of light. Look, there's Kant saying that Hume was onto something in his critique of traditional metaphysics, but Hume didn't have it quite right, and Kant wants to go further and improve upon Hume's critique of traditional metaphysics. Let's dig in a little deeper here. I've included on our outline for today just a restatement of Hume's famous critique of traditional metaphysics, right? Again, Hume argued, as we saw last time, that all knowledge is relations of ideas or matters of fact. Relations of ideas are definitional truths that can be understood just by understanding the meanings of the concepts involved in them. Matters of fact are not definitional truths, and they must be known through experience. The claims of the traditional or school metaphysics, claims such as God exists, or that we have free will, or that there are immortal souls, these are neither relations of ideas nor empirically knowable matters of fact. So traditional metaphysics cannot produce knowledge, or so argues Hume. But Kant believes this line of argument is deeply flawed. And Kant says it's flawed because Kant says it's not true that all knowledge is either relations of ideas or empirically knowable matters of fact. Kant argues that there's a third branch of knowledge that Hume completely overlooks in his critique of the traditional or school metaphysics, right? Again, so you got to keep in mind that, Hume felt that all knowledge is either relations of ideas, which is the definitional truth, right? And, Hume felt like math, geometry, logic, this was all about relations of ideas, just working out the implications of the concepts employed in those domains. Right, and so that's right. There's relations of ideas according to Hume, and then there's matters of fact, which is not definitional knowing. And matters of fact, all of our beliefs concerning matters of fact are based on empirical evidence. Right, and then Hume want to say, but look, metaphysics is not empirical knowledge if it's knowledge at all, and it's not relations of ideas, so it must be that metaphysics is bunk, baloney. Kant. Let's talk about Kant on the three types of knowledge. While David Hume says there are two types of knowledge, Kant says that there are three types. And Kant calls these types the analytic a priori, the synthetic a posteriori, and the synthetic a priori. For Immanuel Kant, analytic a priori knowledge, these, right, or pieces of analytic a priori knowledge, these are definitional truths in which an understanding of the concepts involved in the statement is sufficient for knowing the truth of the statement, right? All triangles are three-sided figures. That would be an example of what Kant calls analytic a priori knowledge, right? According to Kant, if you grasp the very meaning of the concept of triangularity, you will immediately see that all triangles, by their nature, by the very definition of triangularity, must be three-sided, right? Synthetic a posteriori knowledge expresses non-definitional truth, where the information contained in the predicate of the statement is not already contained in the subject of the statement. And knowing such synthetic a posteriori truths, knowing these requires empirical evidence. Here's the statement: water is a substance which boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Right? That is synthetic a posteriori knowledge. Water is a substance that boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The point here is that, look, you can understand and know what water is. You can grasp the concept of water, and yet that doesn't mean that you're going to recognize from the very concept of water that it boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Somebody who understands what water is may fully understand what water is and yet not know that it boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. To recognize that water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, you have to have the empirical evidence of subjecting it to that temperature and then seeing that it boils. So our knowledge that water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, that's a piece of synthetic a posteriori knowledge. To say that it's a posteriori is to say that to know it requires empirical evidence, right? I have in my notes here, one can full well know what water is and not know that it boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, to know this requires the empirical evidence involved when one heats water in the appropriate manner. These two Kantian categories of knowing, right? The analytic a priori and the synthetic a posteriori, these two categories of Kantian knowledge, they correspond roughly with Hume's relations of ideas and matters of fact, right? That is, Kant's analytic a priori is the same thing as Hume's relations of ideas. Kant's synthetic a posteriori is the same thing as Hume's matters of fact knowledge. But Kant points out that Hume failed to recognize that there was a third type of knowledge, namely the synthetic a priori knowledge. Synthetic a priori knowledge, this is non-definitional knowledge in which the information in the predicate is not already contained in the subject. And it can nonetheless be known without empirical evidence. In other words, right, Kant believes that we can have non-definitional knowledge in which what is predicated of the subject can be known without empirical evidence. Synthetic a priori knowledge. Hume believed that there was no synthetic a priori knowledge. But Kant says that was a big mistake. Indeed, Kant argues that mathematics is full of synthetic a priori knowledge. He famously argues that a statement like 7 plus 5 equals 12 is a piece of synthetic a priori knowledge. Kant believes that one can full well know what 7 means, what the term or 7 means. One can full well know what the term 5 means. And a person can full well know what addition means and not thereby recognize that 7 plus 5 sums up to 12. And yet we know that 7 plus 5 equals 12. We know this to be true, but it's not empirically based knowledge. And therefore, for Kant, there is synthetic a priori knowledge. Math is loaded with it. Therefore, Kant sees that he believes Hume's critique of metaphysics is really problematic. It's based on a presumption that there is no synthetic a priori knowledge. And Kant wants to say, but there is. And Kant wants to say that in math, and not just math, geometry are loaded with synthetic a priori knowledge. Indeed, Kant thinks that there is some synthetic a priori knowledge that lies at the heart of natural science as well. Now, some of you might be, let me also back up here. I mean, Kant, I have in my version of the Prolegomena, it's page 14, but I'll give you the pagination or the margin. I'm looking at 269, the margin pagination numbers for Prolegomena, Any Future Metaphysics. Kant writes, it might at first be thought that the proposition 7 plus 5 equals 12 is a mere analytic judgment, following from the concept of the sum of 7 and 5 according to the principle of contradiction. But on closer examination, says Kant, it appears that the concept of the sum of 7 plus 5 contains merely their union in a single number, without its being at all thought what the particular number is that unites them. The concept of 12 is by no means thought by merely thinking of the combination of 7 and 5, and analyze this possible sum as we may, we shall not discover 12 in the concept. We must go beyond these concepts by calling to our aid some intuition corresponding to one of them, either our 5 fingers or 5 points, and we must add successively the units of the 5 given in the intuition to the concept of 7. Hence, our concept is really amplified, added to, by the proposition 7 plus 5 equals 12, and we add to the first concept a second one that is not thought within it. Arithmetical judgments are therefore synthetic, and the more plainly according as we take larger numbers, for in such cases it is clear that however close we analyze our concepts without calling intuition to our aid, we can never find the sum by such mere analysis. Right? I always find that interesting. Arithmetical judgments are therefore synthetic, and the more plainly according as we take larger numbers. I think what Kant is getting at here, there are different ways. I feel like I should say a bit more about this, but I think what Kant is getting at here is that, again, somebody can understand full well what the number 7 is, can grasp that concept. Somebody can understand full well what the number 5 is, can grasp that concept. Somebody can understand full well what it means to add 2 numbers, and yet it may not be obvious to that person. Despite their full understanding of 7 and addition and 5, it may not be obvious to them that the sum equals to 12. And so this cannot be analytic a priori knowledge, according to Kant. Think of a child who's never done the addition problem. A young child can understand full well what 7 and 5 are and can understand what addition involves, and yet may not immediately recognize that 7 plus 5 equals 12, right? I mean, after all, I mean, a young child might exhibit his or her understanding of 7. You know, you could just show the child different sets of figures, and you could say, "Is that a a set of 7?" The child might count up and see that there's just 6, and say, "No, that's not 7." You might give the child another set, maybe of 10 objects, and you could ask the child, "Is that a set of 7?" The child might count them up and say, "No, that's not a set of 7. That's a set of 10." You know, and when the child's doing that, the child exhibiting the child's understanding of 7. Right? And then maybe you get the child pop in there a set of 7 objects. The child counts them up, gets to 7, says, "Yes, that's a set of 7." And the child expresses the understanding of the concept of 7. And you could do something similar with a set of 5. And the child may understand what addition is, but when you originally present to the child the 7 plus 5, the child may not, know. The child will full well understand 7, will full well understand 5, will know what addition involves, but the child won't come to the recognition that 7 plus 5 equals 12 until the child does something like this. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then the child might have to go back and count up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 7 plus 5 equals 12, right? But Kant's going to say that's not deducing what's in the concept of 7 plus 5 to get to the 12. Rather, we're adding to our knowledge. We're amplifying our knowledge. We're not just parceling out what's in the meaning of 7 plus 5. So this is synthetic knowledge, but it's also it's not empirically based knowledge. Kant says at this point works even better with larger numbers, and I think he's right about that. I mean, look, if somebody asked me right now, what is 1,365,271 plus 3,265,497. What do those equal? Well, look, I understand perfectly well what that person is asking me when he asks that question. But I don't know. But I don't know what they equal. I understand the concept of those two very large numbers, and I can exhibit my understanding of those two very large numbers. And I can exhibit my understanding of addition by writing those numbers out and then solving the addition problem, right? And if I do my calculations correctly, I will figure out what the sum of those two large numbers is, right? But I exhibit my understanding in working out the problem, right? But the actual sum of those two numbers is not inherent to the concept of those, because I understood the concepts of those numbers, and I understood addition prior to arriving at the knowledge of their sum. So the sum, right, the articulation of what the sum of those two large numbers amounts to is amplifying my knowledge. It's not just teasing out what is inherent to the concepts involved. And so knowing the sum of those two very large numbers is a case of synthetic knowledge, not analytic. And again, it is a priori knowledge. I don't have to actually go and physically, empirically count out 1,300,000. I can't remember what the numbers were. I don't have to count out and visually see these massive numbers of sets of things to know the truth about what those two large numbers sum up to. And so, look, and what is the core message? So Kant thinks that there is this synthetic a priori knowledge in math. But again, this would be, right, synthetic a priori knowledge is not Hume's relations of ideas. It's not Hume's matter-of-fact knowledge. It's a distinct kind of knowledge. And, Kant wants to make the point that metaphysics, if it exists at all, it is synthetic a priori. Math is synthetic a priori. Well, we can have synthetic a priori knowledge in math. Maybe we can have it in metaphysics too. So we need to revisit the question of the possibility of metaphysical knowledge. Because if there is metaphysical knowledge, it's synthetic a priori knowledge. Math, according to Kant, math and geometry give us synthetic a priori knowledge. So maybe metaphysics can give us synthetic a priori knowledge. Hume's argument was not good enough, says Kant. We need to revisit the question before we go dismissing all of traditional metaphysics. I'll just go briefly to my last paragraph from the outline. Ultimately, Kant believes that both math and natural science yield some synthetic a priori knowledge. What Kant does is he examines in his book, The Prolegomena, Kant examines what conditions allow for this synthetic a priori knowledge, and then he examines whether the conditions that allow for this knowledge in math and science, are they also met in the field of metaphysics? Kant is going to do this because if metaphysics yields knowledge, it must be, as I said, synthetic a priori knowledge. So if metaphysics yields synthetic a priori knowledge, then it must meet the conditions for having such knowledge. If so, metaphysics can yield knowledge. If not, then Hume was right after all. All right? So that's where this is heading. Hume's going to want to examine what allows for synthetic a priori knowledge in math and geometry, and what allows for for some of the foundational pieces of synthetic a priori knowledge in the natural sciences. What is it that allows for synthetic a priori knowledge? That's what Hume wants to ask. And then he's going to want to say that once we figure out what allows for synthetic a priori knowledge, we should then maybe consider whether any metaphysical knowledge can be had once we're clear about what makes synthetic a priori knowledge possible. It might be that metaphysics transcends the bounds of any possible knowing. But we need to revisit the question, according to Kant, because, math and geometry, they've got some synthetic a priori knowledge. So the Humean style critique is just not good enough. Hey, we'll do more next time. Let's see. Today I think I had, which group turned in? Group C turned in papers, short assignments for today. I'll want Group A students to explain some aspect of what I talked about today and present a possible question or problem regarding things I talked about for today. Hey, I'll see you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.